So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Tuesday night workshop. We have the very gifted and talented Mr. Ashley Bloom. So we welcome him to our workshop this evening to present to us on illustration. Well, not just illustration, Ashley, what else would you be presenting this evening?
Thanks for having me here, Leah and NEC. I'm going to be talking about illustration and design. I actually work as a photographer and videographer as well, but I think I started kind of all my work with illustration and design. So we're going to kind of break it into two today. We'll start looking at illustration and art, and then look at design in the second half.
Okay, great. So we're looking forward to everything that you have for us this evening. We've seen some of your work with Lineage and just around. I've seen you on the Apple website, and you're always smiling. So tell us something that made you smile today.
Okay, today, I think just having the sunshine again. I was sitting out in the garden. I was enjoying a little bit of nature. I've been blessed. I've been able to stay with family for the lockdown. So I don't usually in my flat in London have a garden. So I've just been enjoying time in the garden as much as I can. Yeah, that definitely made me smile.
Okay, and what makes you smile the most about the ministry of illustration?
I think what it is with illustration, sometimes there's those passages in the Bible that you read and you know by heart. There's this, obviously the passage in the Bible when in Genesis it starts talking about God as creator. He creates the world, but one thing that he always does after he creates something is he looks back at it and says it's good or it's very good. And there's something I think you do when you're a creator, when you create, music, when you create writing, or when you create art. And I always do this when I illustrate, is I finish a drawing, but it's not finished when the last pen stroke is done. You have to come back to it and you look at it, and it's not to give yourself a big head. It's just, that's part of the process. And I remember once reading that text where it said God looked back at what he'd made and said it was good. And I was like, oh, I do that. And it reminds me we're made in God's image. He's the creator, therefore he's creative, and we're made in that same image. So that always makes me smile, realizing, when I illustrate something, when I create something, that's the connection to God.
Excellent. Okay, that's good. And we should always be reflective in no matter what we're doing, whatever activity we have. It's good to practice reflection and be reflexive as well. Okay, so shall we pray and then get into the goodness? Would you like to pray for us?
Okay, sure, let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this opportunity to come together like this. And, even though we're not in the same physical space, you allow this to happen where we can all kind of engage together. And we pray now that as we look at creativity, we look at illustration and design in particular, that you just bless us, you inspire us to dedicate our gifts in this area to your service. This is my prayer in your name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, just to remind everyone, if you have questions or when you have questions, just leave them in the chat and then Ashley will address them later on. Okay, so let's go.
Cool. Okay, fantastic. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you guys will be able to see it. Cool, guys. So yes, we are going to go through illustration and design. We're going to start off with illustration, and then we'll have, I guess, some time for questions after the kind of presentation, and then we'll second half look at design. So just to get us started with a kind of introduction, I'll introduce myself first, I guess. I have literally illustrated since I was a small child. I can remember sort of picking up pens and drawing on the walls and getting in trouble for it at the time when I was a kid, but it's kind of carried on from there. And I studied 2 degrees, one in illustration, one in design when I was at university. But since then, I've actually worked, while I was still studying, I set up a company, just worked as a freelancer. And I still do that today. So, I do a lot of private commissions or magazine or book illustrations. But I also teach, as Leah said, I work for Apple as well. I've got a job where I can teach how to draw with the technology, which is great. But the most kind of motivating work, I guess, for me is the illustration I do around spreading the gospel, around ministry. And so I thought I'd share a couple of those things today. So this is not everything I work with, but just some examples. One thing, first of all, though, is why kind of, I guess I think it's important. And there's a couple of texts I wanted to share. The first one is from a book we don't really go too much, but Book of Habakkuk, chapter 2. And this isn't obviously directly related to illustration, but something that God says to the prophet is, write the vision and make it plain on tablets that he may run who reads it. And for me, it's interesting, that verse, because it talks about writing a vision and making it plain, like almost two separate things. And I think that's something that as a church, sometimes we're great at, is writing down the vision, having the actual information, but the teaching of it, the making it plain, isn't always as considered. And I think, it's not so much your message as whether people can understand your message that ultimately becomes the important thing. And I think that's where illustration comes in really, really useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. The second, not the second text, sorry, just that one text. But the application of that text, I guess, one thing that I saw looking back at history, and especially kind of Adventist history, is that they kind of understood the importance of making things plain and illustrating those, especially because the Seventh-day Adventist Church came from a prophetic movement. The Millerites, when they were kind of studying the Bible, they're finding all these things out about prophecy. And I've experienced, when you try and share this information without any kind of visual aids, it's just really confusing. And it's really interesting looking back at these charts. This is a really famous prophetic chart. And you can see that it actually does try and use illustration to make visions that would otherwise be really confusing more clear, so people can kind of follow what's going on. And I love the fact that happens, but I also see, especially when it comes to prophecy, there's this huge need, because I don't know if anyone's ever tried to preach a sermon or illustrate a Sabbath school or something, but sometimes you try and look on Google and just find kind of good illustrations to illustrate your point. I can see, Lee, you're shaking your head. You've been there. It's weird, if you look up Revelations for illustration, a lot of what you get some of the time is this kind of thing. Literally, like, I don't know. You either get, I tend to find, because I do a lot of kind of illustrations, revelation studies and things like that, you get one of two categories. You either get the really kind of horrific and scary Middle Ages version of the prophetic illustration, which is, looks like a ancient magic book, or you get someone who's not great at Photoshop, just stitching parts of animals together. And it looks so cheap and bad that it just, if you think you're trying to give someone this amazing truth and this is what you've got to illustrate it, you realize that that's not going to help. That's actually really going to hinder the message. So I think one thing I saw is there's definitely a need. And the other sort of side of the need is that when you see illustrations or things depicted in the Bible, everyone kind of puts their own slant on them. So, we have a lot of these Middle Ages paintings where all the Bible characters look very kind of effeminate or sort of separate to what their real place in history would have been. And it makes them, again, really hard to connect to what's really going on. And so I think this is one thing when I'm doing kind of illustrations and biblical illustrations, especially, I really try and pay a lot of attention to is not just, does this look right, how I think it should look now, but I think, is this accurate for the time? Is this actually what someone would have seen if they were in Jesus' time or before that? But then especially kind of looking at prophecy, I also wanted to get away from that horrible thing we'd seen before, those kind of mashups on Photoshop of prophetic visions. So I'll show you one thing that I'd worked on fairly recently was a series of prophetic illustrations for Daniel and Revelation. And so these were literally started, I think I was in a car ride, we were filming series 2 of Lineage, and we were driving up the coast of California. We had like a 10-hour car ride and nothing to do, so I used the time to start these illustrations. But I just wanted to have a more stylized but also a little bit more realistic representation of what you'd see in Daniel.
Yeah,
And
fantastic.
thanks. I'd actually worked on something a few years earlier, again around Daniel. My friend who was great at writing, and we'd both been studying Daniel's prophecies together, and we were like, let's make a little kind of book, a graphically designed book, which later we updated to be an interactive study guide. It's still available actually as an Apple book if anyone does want to download it.
So where's the
But this
link, or
interact
maybe you'll give us the link later.
Yeah, absolutely. It's called, if you do have Apple Books, so it's on Apple devices. Unfortunately, I'm a bit biased because I only know how to make it for Apple devices. But it's called Can the Bible Be Trusted? So if you go into the Books app and look for Can the Bible Be Trusted, it's free, and you can download it. But the idea was with that to make something where every part of the prophecy that's spoken about, you have a visual, and you also have some historical kind of information in there as well. And it's funny because I made it years ago, but it's something I still to this day use in Bible studies again, because the visuals just help a lot. The other side to it is it's not just as well about what I might create to help kind of illustrate, but recently I've been doing a series of studies on Revelation, and with people at my church, and I had this idea because I'm always illustrating this stuff because I find it interesting and I'm an illustrator. But I thought actually, when I'm illustrating, I really memorize the details because I have to make sure they're accurate. So I set this challenge, and we met, once a week, every week we'd study a chapter of Revelation. And for every chapter, I'd tell them, all right, you have to draw this from this chapter. And I thought at first they'd just ignore it or say no, but they all actually came back with drawings every single week, whether they thought of themselves as illustrators or not. And it really helps kind of cement it in your brain. So yeah, I definitely recommend that as a tactic if anyone is getting into Bible study, just to help your own kind of remembering and understanding things, is actually to draw them out. Cool. Yeah, just I guess a couple more examples, and then we'll sort of have a bit of a Q&A. Doing those kind of Daniel studies, it kind of led to sometimes I'd be sort of showcasing them at events, and I think it was at an NEC event as well. I can't remember the name, but it was Justin Kim was one of the speakers, and at the time he was heading the Sabbath school department. So he saw me kind of doing some drawing in the corner for these Bible studies, and he said, "Oh, you illustrate." And that conversation kind of turned into him asking if I could do some illustrations for the Sabbath school. So it was a couple of years ago, we had the Sabbath school quarterly on stewardship. And yeah, it was a really great opportunity to actually have some of those illustrations that kind of tied in with what the study guide was on. And that in turn kind of led to another opportunity with a good friend of mine, Dean Cullinan. He was working on his podcast while they did that. And like a lot of these kind of ministry jobs that start off as just, can you do me a little favor and do a quick sketch? It turned into a sketch every single episode. But we ended up doing, every time they put an episode of the podcast out, which is a great podcast, by the way. If anyone hasn't listened to it yet, I really, really recommend the Why They Did That podcast. But it goes through different Bible character stories. And so every week I'd draw a different kind of example from one of the Bible characters. And then that kind of almost immediately after, the same type of illustrations. You mentioned one of the projects I'm working on is Lineage. And again, I'm biased, but I really recommend Lineage. It's obviously looking back at the history of the church and the Reformation. And we were having a meeting one day, and they suggested doing a coloring book, because a lot of people were using the episodes to homeschool their kids. And so we put together this coloring book, and I'll play, this one's a short video that we used to kind of promote the coloring book, but it kind of shows kind of the way it was done. And I think one thing that was kind of interesting with this coloring book is that, like we said, this media, we wanted it to be take things to a different level. So as well as just having pictures that people colored in, and we know a lot of adults were using it as well, we also put things like QR codes that you'd scan as you were using it, and they'd take you to the next episode. So I think there's a huge opportunity to use a lot of this media in a more interesting, interactive kind of way. So yeah, I love these kind of QR codes that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a whole kind of multimedia experience.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Would there be a part 2 of that?
Of the coloring book? Yeah, I'm working on it now, actually. So yeah, I can't give you a concrete release date yet because I have to work through it. But yeah, it was hugely popular, actually. So with Lineage itself, we've done 2 complete series, and we're just releasing our 3rd series. So that was the coloring book season 1. So I think we'll hopefully keep it going if we can
I've
get
seen
enough
that
time.
book. It's excellent, actually. Very accurate with the people that you're illustrating. Really good. So well done.
Thank you. Cool. And then this is the last kind of example to mention. Again, like I think with the whole going back to that original point that we were saying about illustration kind of making things more plain and more understandable, I thought like one of the ultimate examples for me was comics. I kind of grew up on comics, and obviously it would be like Marvel or DC comics when I was a kid. But I love the idea of certain parts of the Bible are so cinematic and the stories are so powerful that they kind of lend themselves to comics. And one part I love is 1st and 2nd Samuel, the whole sort of story of David, you know, from Samuel to Solomon and David's story in between. So I started a little while ago this comic book of David's life, and it started with the battle against Goliath.
Right.
And unfortunately, I've got so busy, I hadn't ever been able to completely finish it. But that kind of evolved into something that I am working on right now, which is a series called David's Mighty Men. And this is basically a series that was born out of me just reading through the Bible, all the stories of David's different captains and the different men in his life. And just thinking there's so many lessons. It's such an interesting story, but there's so many lessons here. That I wanted to do it as kind of almost a series of Bible studies. And I kind of sat on this idea, didn't do anything with it for a couple of years. But this coming Sabbath, we're actually going to start this as a series. Myself and 6 other guys are going to be doing the series kind of aimed at, especially at young men, but kind of open to everyone, called David's Mighty Men. And over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be doing Bible studies looking at these characters. But it's interesting because this kind of came from the illustrations came first, and then the idea for the Bible study kind of came afterwards. So yeah, this will be starting on Saturday, but all of the illustrations kind of feed into what we're going to be studying.
Right.
So
is this a Bible study for adults or teens or anyone?
I'd say kind of teens upwards, really. Like we definitely welcome anyone. Like we said, it's aimed at you know, we're focusing on men in the studies, but it's actually going to be useful, I think, for everyone, for younger kids, for women, for men, because it's really breaking down the psychology of why we do what we do. And each character is going to be kind of looking at, okay, we know what they did, but what made them make those decisions, because we have some of the same patterns of behavior in our lives, so I had to kind of address that. So yeah, very excited about that. If anyone does want to kind of follow, it's going to be streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. And if you just search for David's Mighty Men 2020 on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, all the details are going to be on there.
Good.
Cool. But yeah, that is, I think, me up to the present day in terms of what I'm working on. Just a couple of other things I did want to share, because I know this sometimes gets asked, and we might sort of ask about it a bit more. But there are, as an illustrator, there are for me some things that I say when it comes to like Bible illustration, there are some things that I would actually never illustrate, sort of committed not to. And I think for me, a lot of it is tied into this verse, Exodus 20 verse 4. So we know, you know, about in the 10 Commandments, it does give this command not to make a graven image, not to make an idol and worship it. And obviously, you know, we don't tend to do that, you know, make a stone or a wooden kind of idol with the intention of bowing down. But I do think one thing I've seen over history is a lot of people almost making God in their own image, saying, you know, I want God or Jesus or the prophets or whatever to look like me or act like me. And I think it's so destructive, because we're told, you know, that God said to us, let us make man in our own image, and we kind of try and reverse that process. So I think for that reason, there are some things in the Bible, like I always try and avoid doing any depictions of Jesus, especially Jesus' face. I just won't do it. Or things that I know I can never do justice to, like, you know, trying to draw heaven. I'd kind of steer away from it, because I think, well, I could spend the next 50 years on it and I just won't do justice to it. So there are some things that I tend to try and avoid for that reason, but mainly just to kind of, the purpose of the illustration is to stick faithfully and expand on the word. So not put less of myself in it, but just bring the word out to more people.
Good. I'm of the same opinion. I'm not sure why we try to create Jesus pictures that clearly do not look like. I don't want my Jesus to look like that. Let's just say that. I've seen a few variations, but I want my Jesus to be better, stronger, and much more relatable.
Yeah, definitely.
Looking Jesus that I've seen. Does anybody have any questions? This is a time to open the floor. Will you in the future include women in the Bible? Did you know I was thinking that, MK? So let's hear it, Ashley.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, in fact, kind of tied to this study, the David's Mighty Men study that I was going to do, I wanted to, at the very same time, be running a sort of women from the Bible equivalent study. It was hard to get that happening at the same time, but I'm desperately kind of looking to make that happen. So yeah, I think 100%. There's a lot of other illustrations. I've shown a few examples here, but there's a lot of other illustrations that I've done that center on women from the Bible as well. But definitely I'd love to do that as a series. So yeah, if anyone's interested or volunteering to teach that, let me know. But, yeah.
Oh, can you read the chat?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Do you want to adjust that one?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just read out the question. It says, I work on photography-based designs for social media and want to integrate illustration. But when I think about how to approach it, as in themes or subjects, I just go blank. I have phrases I use and I look for photos that match up, but I find that when I think about what illustration would go with that, I have a hard time. What can I do? Yeah, really good question. I'm the same. I mean, I think one of the reasons I got into photography was because as a designer, I was always looking for, you know, stock images, and sometimes I could never find it. So I thought, let me get my own camera, and I kind of got into photography that way. Actually, now I do it as a job. But I think on the reverse of it, like finding good illustration. I think one thing I tend to do if I'm looking for illustration for a project or a study or graphics is I kind of try and work out the feel or the look of the illustration I want first, rather than just looking for a specific image that ties in. So, for example, if I was doing a project on health and I wanted to do, as well as photos, to have some illustrations for it, I think what I would do, instead of thinking, okay, I definitely need an image of a pineapple, and then you spend hours on Google searching for pineapple that doesn't fit, is say, let me actually see a style of illustration that I can find. And it might be a case of going to stock sites. It might be, there are some really good kind of art stock sites, or it depends the level of your work, maybe contacting an illustrator directly if you really like their work, and then just saying, you know, this is what I'm trying to achieve. Either if they're working for you, can you create this? Or being maybe less specific about what you need. So if it was a health thing and I was looking for a picture of a grapefruit, I couldn't find an illustration of that. I'd use other fruit or something else to add it in. So I guess being less specific, but finding the style that really kind of suits.
We have another question. Do you have a database of photos that churches can use for Bible studies? And they want to know what the copyrights are regarding your images.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, actually, I don't. I need to get better at this. I'm working on soon uploading my images to stock sites. I do. If someone does have specific images that they want that I have, they can email me. They can contact me. The best way to get in contact is my website, which is just ashleybloom.net, and people usually contact me through there if they've seen any work that I've done and they want to contact. But no, I think with a database of photography, it's something I do want to work on getting kind of my work out there more, but at the moment I haven't built it yet.
Okay, you have got so many questions rushing in. Somebody wanted to know why you started with men rather than women. Is that just your preference?
No, I think with the men thing, that was literally just for this study. So the study that I'm doing with David is just called David's Mighty Men because it's a men's ministry study, but that's that's definitely not the only type of thing I do. So yeah, there's been other prophecy series, other series, for example, like prophecy or other things where that will be the focus. This one is, I guess, aimed at a men's ministry study, but there's no sort of preference for any particular theme.
Okay, we have another. How did you find getting into the industry? So they're looking for advice for those who are interested in that career path.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot sometimes to be nervous or negative about of how the world is at the moment. But I think one thing that is actually really positive in terms of how the world is at the moment is it's the perfect time if you're trying to build skills and get into a new type of career like illustration. The one downside is there's a lot of competition because there's a lot of great illustrators out there, but the really huge plus side is that your work is so accessible, it's so possible. I wouldn't say easy, but it's so possible to get your work out there in a way that, literally when I was studying at uni, you really had to be going to people in person or sending your portfolio of work to people. Whereas nowadays, if you put in a bit of time on social media, you can gain quite a big following of your work. And I think one of the things I'd really recommend for anyone starting out today is to develop your own style, find out the way you'd like to work. And that doesn't mean that's your style that you're stuck with for life. You can keep changing it, but just develop something that's kind of unique. It's kind of your voice. Try not to look, learn things from other illustrators, but don't try and look just like other illustrators because people are going to look for your work if there's something unique about it. But then put it out there. You literally, be consistently posting on Instagram, consistently, maybe look at other platforms like Behance and other places where you can put your work. But I'd also say keep working, keep illustrating. If you're not being paid for work at the start, don't let that stop you. Just keep making work. And it's funny because some of the projects I shared, like the Daniel and Revelation projects or the David projects, they started as me literally drawing because I was bored or because I had an idea in my head. And now I'm using them for something. So that work that you do that's you're not already being paid for, it always exists, and you'll be able to find a use for it later as well. So I'd say just keep working. It's the most important thing.
Okay, so would you say focus on one thing at a time? Because you said develop almost like your signature illustration rather than looking at other people's and trying to be like someone else. Would you say focus on one thing at a time, or is it okay to?
No, I'd say develop your style. So one thing I'll talk about when we talk about graphics is it's super important to be influenced by people when you're starting out. So I think at the start you take in as many influences as you can, and as you're trying to get better at illustration, you try and figure out how did someone create this effect that I love so much. How did they do that with it? What colors did they focus on or restrict themselves to get that particular look? And you're learning, you're literally trying to deconstruct things. But as you keep doing that, you also kind of start building up, okay, well, I liked this from this illustrator, I took this from this illustrator, and that's all blending into my own style. And that's what all great artists kind of through time have done. They've had their influences, but they've kind of taken them and then kind of built up their own style based on that.
Okay. Do you offer design and illustration tutorials?
I have in the past. There's not something that I do all the time just because I stay really busy. But yeah, I think places like this, I did a few classes with Craig and the guys at Peace. We did kind of a workshop on design and illustration. I've done others in those kind of contexts before with other kind of schools. And my day job, like I say, I work for Apple as a trainer. So when before lockdown, when that was all going strong, generally every day I'd be doing tutorials, looking at drawing on an iPad and stuff. So I do sometimes. I don't have a regular school set up or anything, but it's something I'll be carrying on doing. And yeah, if you do want to know about them, please just follow any kind of social media or on my website. I'll post up information if I'm doing new ones or posting new ones online.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you've always been creative since a child. You were writing and drawing on the walls. This person would like to know, how did you see that you could use your creativity for the gospel? That's a good question. And what advice would you give to those who are creative and passionate about art and ministry?
Awesome. So it's funny, a lot of the kind of inspiration for getting into drawing was feeling frustrated that drawings didn't already exist. So what I mean by that is my mum is a writer. She's a poet and a writer. So her publishers would always send us free books when we were growing up. And so I literally grew up reading everything. Like I literally couldn't get to sleep without reading a book when I was growing up. But I would love illustrated books, and I would get really frustrated when a book wasn't illustrated. And that kind of led me to trying to do the illustrations for that book myself. And it's kind of the same in the Bible. There's certain parts where I'm reading passages from the Bible, and I'm like, I'd really like to see, what this was like. And if it doesn't already exist, like, you'd be amazed how much of the Bible just you can't find great illustrations for. I was reading through the book of Nehemiah recently, and you can't find anything on the web, the whole internet of good Nehemiah illustrations. So if I see there's kind of a need and I'm really enjoying studying something, I'm like, okay, well, let me contribute, let me actually make something here. And I think the advice I give is probably one of the biggest ones is research. So what I mean by that is it's really important for me that if you're going to create an illustration with the aim of making a Bible study clearer, making it come to life more, that it's that what you're drawing is true to the text. Because if you think about it, when we're preaching, we make such a big deal about not misquoting the text or not making the text say what it doesn't say, but we can do that when we create drawings. I think a great example, if you think of, for example, all the children's books you've seen of Noah's Ark, and they're children's books, so you don't think it's a big deal, but they're always like these tiny little boats with a giraffe's head sticking out of it that wouldn't stay afloat in a mild sea. And it seems fine because it's just children's books, but they're so unbelievable that as children grow up on them, the idea of there being a real physical flood just seems far-fetched. And I think you could really combat that if you had good illustrations. And I love, when I was growing up, I had a children's Bible that wasn't illustrated for children. It was just illustrated normally, and I got so much more from studying that. So I think that that is a really good kind of motivator to draw accurately. But also, like I say, you figure out things a lot better. Like when I was doing the David and Goliath illustrations, one thing I researched was in the text, it says that there were no blacksmiths in Israel. They had to buy their weapons from the Philistines. So you could tell that if you had two armies lined up fighting each other, the Israelites shouldn't be all decked out in armor because they didn't have any. And realizing that to illustrate it, I was like, okay, now I understand the story from a completely different perspective, because Israel were definitely the underdogs in this fight. I only learned that because I was illustrating it. So yeah, I'd say research is probably like my biggest thing if you're getting into Bible illustration.
Yes, just to make sure that it's accurate. Like with the Noah's Ark thing, I've only ever seen the animals going in 2 by 2. They don't talk about the sevens.
Yeah, exactly.
You never see that. Okay, there's another question. What do you think about creating a series of prompts for Bible illustrations for a month? Oh, I don't know if somebody's trying to employ you to do something.
No, I love this. I find this is a really good idea. I did this Inktober thing. Some of you guys may have tried it, but I did this a couple of times. And when I did it, it was because sometimes, if you're like me, if you do illustration as a job, even though you got into it because you were so passionate about it, it gets tiring. And sometimes you get to the point where you almost feel guilty for drawing something if you're not being paid for it, because you're like, I don't have time to just draw for fun anymore. And it kind of makes you not love it like you should. And so I remember when I did one of these Inktober challenges, it was like so refreshing. I'm like, look, I'm just drawing for fun now. I'm not trying to do this, for a client. I'm not stressing about this drawing. I'm just doing it for fun. And it completely refreshed me kind of creatively. And I'd really advise anyone who is a creative in any area, make sure you make time to do things for yourself. And I think that's an amazing idea. So yeah, I think it should happen. We should do a biblical Inktober style challenge with prompts.
Ashley, why don't you just set it up for next month? Why don't you do that?
Absolutely.
We have a few months left of the year. I think you can choose one and let's just get started.
Okay.
So that's it for those questions. Thank you very much, everybody.
Cool.
Thought provoking. Oh, there's another. 1 second. You got it?
Yes, I'll just read Namsa's comment. She says, the Bible story series by Arthur Maxwell had lovely illustrations.
Yeah.
It really helped my Bible knowledge as a child, so I totally agree about accurate illustrations. So yeah, 100%. It's so funny because I think for a lot of us, if we think back on where we first started learning Bible stories, it was those books that had such a profound impact on us. So yeah, those books being good quality and the illustrations being good quality is so huge. Okay, thank you guys for the questions.
So would you like to go into the other side of the presentation?
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, we talked illustration. The second thing I want to share with you guys is design. So they're definitely linked and they're a little bit similar, but there are some different principles. And this is going to be a bit different. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my work, but I want to actually give you guys some tips for design as well, because I think with illustration, you know, maybe not everyone gets into it. If you're already really into drawing, or you kind of have a gift for illustration, you will. But I think with design, more and more, a lot of us, whatever our background, need to know how to do good design, either for work or for church. So I want to share some practical stuff, and hopefully it helps you guys as you're designing. So the first thing is kind of, I guess, a definition of what design actually is. So as you can see, it's the art or skill of combining text and pictures in advertisements, magazines, or books. And yeah, the idea is basically kind of like what we said for illustration, but I guess more so is design is all about communication. And it's funny, I actually studied design since kind of probably before I was a professional illustrator. I was a designer. And like I said, I did that graphics degree at university. And it was weird. It was actually at university that I got my first real job doing anything visual, because me and my flatmates started the design business and before we finished uni, and we actually kind of got work and learned a lot of the ropes, probably by making a lot of mistakes as well. But then also, obviously, a lot of my design, a lot of the things I learned about design happened in church. They made me a youth leader at my church, and it was always a big thing to, if you were going to do a youth day or an event or something, to have a poster for it. And a lot of the time the poster's like a afterthought, but because I was studying design, I'd always take these things really seriously, and I wanted, like, even if it was like a small youth day, you'd try and turn it into an event. And one thing I learned is kind of the importance of branding something well. So I'd take a particular, if I designed a poster, I'd be like, okay, this poster, this has to be the theme that goes on all the bulletins, it has to go on all the slides, it has to just be something that looks professionally done. It looks like we've actually taken time over this because we care about it. So that was, yeah, definitely a principle I found that I built just from doing local stuff in church. But obviously that then ties into the more professional design stuff that we work on. So yeah, once again, one of the projects that I've been involved in for the last few years, since 2017, is Lineage Journey, which, if you guys haven't seen it, it's a documentary series going back through Christian history, through the Reformation, through Adventist history. And I'm the lead designer on that project. And so I think one thing that's really important is whatever you're making, every 5 seconds, Adam or Clive or one of the guys might ask me, can we get a poster for this or an Instagram post for that? And it's knowing, okay, this is the design language. It's got to be consistent across everything. That's a really important part of it. And at the moment, again, this is like something new and exclusive. We're telling you pre-release, but we're just about to release something we've been working on, which is, as well as the video series, we've been making interactive study guides. So similar to the first annual study guide that I mentioned, but basically every episode of Lineage we've turned into a guide which has way more information and photos that we took on location and maps and a bit more of the in-depth history. So that's going to be released really, really soon. Look out for that, but we're going to give more info on that soon. Okay, so that's what I've been doing. But again, like illustration, I wanted to talk a bit about how it's relevant to the gospel. And again, it's kind of almost an obscure text, but one of my favorites is in Exodus 35, verse 35. This is when they're making the sanctuary, and God says to Moses, you know, I want you to make the sanctuary. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be covered in gold. And it's going to have these intricately woven curtains and cloths and things. But he doesn't say just let anyone make it. He says, these are the people you're going to pick. You're going to pick this guy Bezalel. You're going to pick, you know, these other individuals named by name. And then God says why. He says, because he's filled them with skill to do all kinds of work as engravers, designers, embroiderers in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine linen and weavers, all of them skilled workers and designers. And so for me, that was a really interesting point, because it's that these people, they were chosen because of their design ability, but it wasn't just something that came from them. God said he's filled them with the skill. It's literally like a spiritual gift that God has put this in them. But then the more I started thinking about that, what was really interesting to me is, where would these people have learned these skills as engravers? You know, they were a nation of slaves. But if you've been to Egypt, you'd have seen, you know, those pyramids and temples, they're very nicely decorated and designed. And that just made me think, so these guys had learned, maybe they'd learned their craft in Egypt, you know, they'd learned their craft in the world, but God said, okay, that skill that you've now learned, I want you to put it to my use. And it was funny, because it was really in university that I really started paying attention to God. So I was already in my degree, I was learning all these skills, you know, to make websites or whatever, just for normal secular work. But then I realized, actually, God's allowed me to use these things that I've learned in the world. I can really apply them to his work. And hopefully the mindset that you take into it is to make things that are not of an inferior quality just because they're for church. You know, if anything, they should be better because they're serving a higher purpose. So that's something I've always been passionate about. And again, the why is this, that we have the Great Commission. It says, you know, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And I think a huge part of that, again, is getting the message out there. And maybe it shouldn't be like this, but it definitely is, that people will pay more attention to a message that's well packaged. You know, and I used to have a design teacher in university that had a T-shirt that said "Good design saves lives," and we thought that might be going a bit too far. But honestly, there's things that you won't pay attention to if they're not presented or designed in a good way. And because we're trying to get people to pay attention to the gospel, I think knowing how to present it well is so important. So yeah, that's a bit of the background. I think the last thing we're going to do, a very, very crash course, a short kind of tutorial in good and bad design practice. So yeah, please follow along, take notes if you are designing anything. But we'll start off with the good. So these are a couple of tips. I think some of the most important things. I've kind of distilled everything I learned in 3 years of studying at uni down into about 5 slides. But hopefully, like the essence of it makes a lot of sense. So I think the first thing, the number one thing, and this is the case, if someone just says to you, okay, we've got a youth day coming up, we need a poster, can you make it? I think the number one thing that I say is to think about hierarchy. So hierarchy basically means, what's the most important thing that you want people to see first, and then kind of go down in descending order. And that will, you know, that will affect how you present that information and the choices you make of how big your text is or what fonts you use. Everything comes back to hierarchy. How do you communicate this most effectively? And one example that I like is this road sign. And you might think, that's not got any hierarchy, that's just a sign, it's not that important. But if you think about, if you were to remove the hierarchy, if you were not to say one part is more important than any other part, the sign now doesn't make any sense. And if you're driving, you know, you'd probably miss that this is a one-way street and you might have a horrible accident. So, you know, good design really does save lives here. If you think about all signs, use hierarchy because they're trying to grab your attention in a very short time while you're driving past them. So it's the same thing when you are creating something like a poster, is maybe to think about what is the one piece of information, if they couldn't catch the rest of the poster, you'd want them to know? And most of the time, that's going to be the name of the event. Because worst case, if they miss everything else, they can look online for the name of your event and maybe find more information. If they only get the time, but they don't remember what the event's called, then you've lost them. So I usually start by thinking, okay, the name is probably the really important thing. The time and date and location is maybe next. And then maybe a description of, what it is and how to get in touch and find out more. Cool. So that's the first thing. I guess the second thing is space. And I guess that means two things. One is leaving enough space for your design to breathe. And then the second is trying to use that space. I like these examples. I found this online, just film posters. And someone just boiled them down to simple shapes. But most of this poster is just empty space. And I think it's kind of a really effective thing. This kind of hurts your eyes, but this is the alternative. This is not a good example. This one's a bad one. But let's be honest, I think a few of us have seen church bulletins that look a bit like this. And it's like an assault on your eyes. It's just too much information. And the ironic thing is, the more information you have, usually the better. But when you have too much, it's worse because there's so much there, you don't take in anything. So I think just knowing when to leave off certain bits of information or condense that information down and leave enough space for your design is super important. Cool. Okay, number 3 is something called alignment. And it basically means sometimes you have a page like this and this page looks really random, right? But if you actually were to draw grid lines across it, you'll see there's not one part of that design that's not connected to another part in some way because they're on the same sort of grid line or grid structure. And this is one thing we learned, I think, on day 1 of my design degree, was that always work with the idea of a background grid or a background kind of alignment in your designs. I think a lot of the time when you find designs that just don't work, you're not sure why. It's because elements aren't lined up with each other. So yeah, that's super important.
It's the same with photography, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So with photography, you're usually thinking subconsciously, like you don't really think about it unless maybe you're teaching it or being taught it. But with photography, you're also trying to line elements up. You don't just want random things in any part of your picture, but you're trying to make elements of one design or picture interact with other elements. So they all seem like one coherent thing. And yeah, the last kind of good design practice is influence. And I related this to one more Bible verses in Corinthians. 2 Corinthians tells us, by beholding, we become changed. Now, it's definitely true in terms of, our behavior, our attitudes, and, the way we act. But it's also true in terms of design. If you want to be a better designer, the very best way is to surround yourself with good design. You'll take in some of those principles. A lot of them you'll be aware of. Some you'll just pick up subconsciously, what works and what doesn't. And so one thing I would say is if someone says make a poster for this event, this day, campaign, whatever, before you start trying to put any of those elements in, search the web for designs that you like and try and pick out what it is that you like about them. So one thing I would say is there's great websites out there specifically for this, like Behance. I think Pinterest is a great one to find versions of designs that you like. Cool. So that's the good. Just before we get to questions, I will show you the bad. So these are definite don'ts. So please don't do this if you want your designs to be good. So the first one is mixing and matching too much. And what I mean by that is things like colors and typefaces. You'll find the most effective designs don't go overboard. They won't tend to have more than 1 or 2 typefaces through whatever it is they're designing. They'll keep it consistent. And colors as well. You don't want to have every color under the sun, but you want to kind of almost pick a color scheme that works. It's like, I guess, coordinating clothes. The other thing is types of types. So you have serif fonts. Serifs are the little tails to fonts. So you can see the bottom example here looks a bit more traditional because it's got those serifs on. Sans serifs don't have those tails. The reason they have a particular feel is that serif fonts they're sort of leftovers from when you used to have movable physical type. So in the olden kind of days where you used to have physical type pressing machines, they'd have to have serifs because they cut the letters out of lead. Sans serifs look a lot more modern because you don't need to do that with digital type. So generally, sans serif fonts will look a lot more modern. If you're making a modern type poster, use those. Serif fonts look a bit more traditional. So there's always exceptions, but that's like the general rule. If you don't follow this, you end up with stuff like this.
Oh boy.
Which, we've seen these before, but yeah, just a million different typefaces, a million different colors, and yeah, it just looks really amateurish. So I think trying to stay disciplined and stick to one or two fonts and typefaces is really helpful. And then this one, make it fit to purpose. So what I mean by that is I remember when I first got, a copy of Photoshop, I was trying to put lens flares and metallic text on everything because I thought it was cool, but it just doesn't fit everything that you're trying to make. I think one example I found that was interesting is this flyer. Now, I remember when I first saw this flyer, I thought, okay, that's a mixtape, that's someone's rap album or something, but it's actually for a church service. And I can see what they're trying to do. They're sort of trying to appeal, I guess, to people on the street. But the fact is, I think if you were looking for a church service, you're not going to pick this up. If you are looking for, a mixtape or a rap album, you're going to read it and then probably throw it away. So I think having something that kind of really fits in with the message that you're trying to give is the most important thing when you're choosing how to design, what fonts to use, what pictures to use. And then, yeah, finally, again, just know your resources. And this is not so much looking at things like we saw with Behance and Pinterest. This is knowing what tools you can use to design stuff. I think a couple of my favorites, one that you can see here is the Canva app. If you haven't used Canva or the website before, really super useful, even if especially if you're not a designer, because it's a free resource that has loads of templates. So it's a great starting point. Even if you don't have a final poster made on Canva, you can pick up which posters kind of work and try and replicate those designs. A couple of apps that I like, there's literally millions out there, but Adobe apps, one of the ones I use for design a lot is an app called Adobe Comp. Or even Pages or Word. If you've got those applications nowadays, you can actually do some great design on that stuff. You don't need really expensive software. So yeah, just know there's a lot kind of out there to help you kind of get started designing straight away. And also kind of get inspired. Like I said, look for great design, things that you love, and then try and kind of copy them and make, find what it is about them you like, but then make it your own. Cool. And final thing, I guess, before we have probably just a couple of minutes for questions, just one last verse, which is, again, not directly related to design, but definitely a design principle, is let all things be done decently and in order. So definitely when it comes to creating anything that kind of encapsulates the message that you're trying to put out there, is make sure it's readable, it's legible, and it makes things clearer. It doesn't make them more complicated. And if you keep that one principle, I think your design work will be amazing.
This was so interesting, Ashley. So now every time I look at a bulletin, I'm thinking I need to call Ashley so he can sort this out.
Sorry, I don't want to make everyone like really judgmental about their design in their own church, but maybe it'll help.
Okay, so we're going to open up for questions. If anybody has any, now is the time. I was told that there's a particular way in which we're supposed to do our posters, SDA posters, kind of like what you were saying about the grid lines supposed to leave. It's supposed to be sectioned into 7 spaces. Have you heard about this?
I haven't heard about that. I'm kind of interested in that, actually. So yeah, so it's sectioned into 7
spaces, and the last bit, the 7th space, is supposed to leave blank, representing, the 7 days of the days of creation, and then Sabbath being the rest. If you've not heard of it, then
I'm definitely looking it up afterwards. Yeah, it looks like people in the chat have all heard about it, so I've been left out. No, I'll definitely look it up after this.
I don't think everybody uses it, but I like the concept behind it.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. That's the crazy thing about design, like any type of design, not just graphic design, but like product design, is there's so much underlies it that you as the designer know about, but other people won't know about on a conscious level.
Mm.
But I think that's, again, that kind of ties in with God. When I think about, the verse that we read from Exodus was about the sanctuary. If you think about the amount of effort they put into making parts of the sanctuary beautiful, but almost
Yes.
no one would ever see. Do you know what I mean? It was because they were kind of serving something higher. So I think even those things that you don't necessarily see on the outside, like that creation grid, sounds
Hmm.
amazing. But I think it's a great example of something that is not necessarily for everyone to pay attention to, but
No.
just to know that's the level of depth that people have gone to in design, which is great.
Hmm. Someone has asked, how can you start an online business for your artwork or Bible artwork? Do you have any advice about that?
Okay, yeah, no, definitely. And like I said, a lot of this stuff I learned from trial and error, so from getting it wrong. But I think a couple of things. One is definitely to spend a lot of time developing yourself and getting to the stage. I think getting to the stage where you're confident in your work. So when I first started illustration and design, I probably got a few jobs before I was fully confident in my work. And so when someone asked for something, I'd automatically be asking myself, oh, what style do they need? Do I need to do it in this style, that style? Whereas I think when you get more confident that this is the way I work, then you're like, well, if they're coming to me, they're going to get me. I'm going to be able
Mm.
to kind of produce something that I'm confident in, and I won't be second guessing myself. So I think that's a good start. The second thing, the thing I get asked the most about is charging and pricing and how to know what to charge and stuff.
Mm.
I think one thing my sister's always showing me, which is great, is there are a few apps out there that help you kind of measure your time as a freelancer, where you can actually tap when you're ready to start a job and tap when you're ready to stop. And if you start doing that first, you can really work out how long something takes you, and then choose to charge an actual amount that fits in with the amount of work that you do, and you don't have to guess. I think that's the scariest part of being a freelancer, is someone asks you for a price and on the spot you're just like, I don't know, let me pull a number out of the air, maybe it's too much, maybe it's too little.
Yeah.
I think once you've worked out what your time is worth and how long something actually takes you, the most helpful thing I learned is to actually write it down. Every job's different and everything, there might be some leeway, but I think actually having a price list is super helpful, because clients, they might not have been in the art world. They're used to knowing what they're getting when they pay you for something. And so if you're able to give them a list and say, look, if it's a logo design, if you want a logo design, I can do 3 designs with this many amendments. This is how much it would cost. Or I could do 6 designs. This is how much it would cost. That kind of thing takes so much of the stress away from being a freelancer and just having to almost make up numbers. So yeah, I would say kind of practice, develop your style, then work out how much your time is worth, and then make it official. Actually have something you can give to people. And yeah, I think people really like that kind of certainty, and it really helps you.
And it makes you come across more professional, doesn't it?
Yeah,
And you know what you're
yeah,
talking when you're definite.
absolutely. And I think this is so needed. Like I say, we need more professional output in terms of the stuff we make, the design and the illustration. But I think also the way we do business with each other, it's great working with people in your own church and stuff. But you want to make sure like that relationship is a really kind of nice professional one, that
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't feel like anyone's being taken advantage of. And that becomes a place where you can really build trust and build a community when people are doing good work and being paid well for their good work.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Any other questions? To follow a DT route, what kind of qualifications do you need, or what kind of qualifications are best to have?
Okay. With DT, I'm guessing kind of more the technical route that we're talking about here. So with that, I'm not too sure. Because yeah, that's not the route kind of I've taken, but I guess there's some elements of this if you were looking at things like architecture or looking at product design or something like that. I think usually doing a degree in one of those subjects definitely helps, but I think with a lot of design work, it is portfolio based, when people are trying to hire you for jobs and stuff. So I think whatever your area of design, whether it's technical design, whether it's architecture, whether it's product design or whatever, just try and do a bit of research, find out, what the qualifications are, if it's something that you want to do, whether you want to study it. But I also think, again, like I said, with print design, is look online, try and find examples of work that you like, and try and build a portfolio based on creating similar content that you can show to someone, and it shows them straight away, this is what I can do, and it's a weird world now. You can do a lot of stuff without having to go to university and study it. Particularly, you can build your knowledge in so many different ways now.
Okay, here's another question. Do you think representation matters when it comes to the Bible art, showing the diversity of the gospel?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think definitely kind of relevant, especially now. I think it does, but here's the thing. I think the most important thing for me from an illustration point of view is truth, is for me representing things as, I guess, almost having the kind of the commitment to the text to represent it as faithfully as you can. So that kind of goes back to what I said about doing kind of research. I remember a lot of the time before I started illustrating some Bible series that I was doing in the past, I spent a lot of time in museums, kind of looking at artifacts from the time that the Bible studies talked about. And I think for me, that's what I try and reflect. So if I'm drawing, the story of Joseph or Moses, I'm going to try and make those people look like people from those areas. And that will be, hopefully that will be fairly representative. So that's, for me, the most important part. Now, I think, obviously, there is an element that's gonna, if you're drawing things from the Bible, there'll be parts of the world that aren't represented, but that doesn't, I think then that's something that you maybe take on board when you're doing other things. So if I'm drawing people, an illustration of people studying the Bible, I think having a representation of all types of people is kind of important. And I think you see the damage that's done by not doing that in so much of our Bible artwork is definitely slanted a certain way towards a certain history. And it actually alienates people to say there's no one in any of these books that looks like me. So I think being conscious about having a wide representation of all people is really important, because that's what the Bible tells us heaven's going to be like, is everyone from every nation and tribe, and everyone's going to be there. So showing that is important. But I also think when you are trying to draw things, that actually happened in the Bible, just trying to be as accurate as it's possible to be is really important as well.
Yeah, that's true. I remember talking to you before about that picture of heaven that just looks like a hippie troop, which I don't relate to at all. And I used to feel really bad about that, not being able to relate to this heavenly picture. What does that mean? I don't want to go to heaven? No, but it's just, I don't relate to that. So that's how I feel. I'm sure there may be other people that don't relate to the images of Jesus.
And I think just to touch on that, it's not always done with a bad intention. Some people think sometimes that this is something that the illustrators thought, how do I alienate some people with this illustration? But I think that's one of the reasons God tells us to be so careful about making images of these things, is because things that mean something in one age mean something completely different in another age. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, you'd see a lot of pictures of Jesus where he looks like a shampoo commercial, like the hair is, absolutely shining and soft, and he's, very pale skin, very light blue eyes or whatever. But he looks like he's never done a day of work in his life, which just isn't right, because he was a carpenter for most of his life. He actually did hard work with his hands, but they've got him looking kind of like, I don't know, like someone who doesn't do any of that. And the reason is, at those times, it was a mark of esteem to be not out in the sun working, but to be kind of honored and inside and away from the sun. So the way Jesus looked in the Middle Ages said, this person's a king, this is great. But that was something that applied to that age and time that doesn't apply today. So it's become outdated. It means something completely different to us. And so I think this is kind of going back to the representation question. This is where we need to be careful that we don't just try and represent what we think is right nowadays, because again, to somebody else, that might mean a completely different thing. I think that's why going for accuracy to the biblical text is the safest way. Hopefully that makes sense.
There's a question that says, what have been the reactions to your Christian illustrations from non-Christian colleagues? Mm.
This has been one of my favorite things, actually, is that illustration is one of those things that, and photography as well, I guess, that kind of really bridge gaps. Because if people, might not be on the same message as you, if you do something professional that looks really good from an illustration point of view, they'll be interested for that reason. And so even today, I started posting the first few of the illustrations from this David series I'm about to start looking at. And loads of friends who aren't Christian or maybe of other faiths or atheists or whatever, they're commenting and actually trying to find out more about those illustrations, about what the thing that we're doing is, mainly because the illustration kind of draws them in. So generally, it's been really kind of positive. And I think I remember when I was drawing those Revelation illustrations I showed you before, I was drawing them on, I think it was the last train home. I'd done a late shift at work. It's the last train home on, I think, a Thursday night or Saturday night. I can't remember what the day is, but I was sitting opposite a couple of guys, and they were just coming back from a night out, and they were like really drunk and stuff. I had my headphones in. I was trying not to like get distracted, but I was just drawing. Then after a while, I took my headphones out and I realized they'd just been staring at the illustration I was doing from Revelation for ages. And they asked me what it was about. They said, "Oh, that's really cool." And I basically had a really short Bible study with them. And it was insane because this would never have happened except for the fact that I was actually drawing in front of them. So it's usually been really good. It's opened a lot of doors.
Good. Because they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and it is true, isn't it?
Definitely.
Absolutely, yeah. Is true. Okay, there's a question regarding charging. How do you go about deciding how much to charge for your work? Okay, so you mentioned going on certain apps. That would be helpful. And then it goes on to say, sometimes friends in church ask for design work, expecting it to be done for free. How do you deal with this if you are a freelancer? Good question.
Yeah, it's a hard conversation sometimes, but I think it's got better. I remember kind of when I first started doing design, every request was, can I do it for free? Same thing for photography within the church. And I think people are starting to realize it's not fair to do that. We wouldn't, if we have a mechanic or a plumber, we don't just say, "Oh, can you do this work for free?" We expect to pay. And I think it's realizing that this is how, people make their living. And especially if, if it's someone in church, just remembering that Bible verse that says the laborer is worthy of his hire, which is something I think we apply to preachers, we apply to other things. But this is effectively for churches, the same type of work. We are trying to use our creative kind of abilities to spread the gospel in the same way that we would if we were preachers. So I think just having that discussion and kind of explaining it, this is A, how I make my living, B, it does take me time, it's not easy. But like I said, I think that's why having things prepared where I literally had written down, this is how much I charge for logo design, this is where the time goes, this is how much I charge per hour, and just having it on a piece of paper that I could give to someone avoided so many of those awkward conversations. So I'd say, first of all, figure out how much your time is worth, how much something takes you, and realistically what you charge. And obviously, I think that should probably be lower when you first start out because you haven't got as much experience. But over time, hopefully, that gets higher and you can live on it. And when you have worked that out, just have it written down that you can give it to someone, I think.
Good. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, so I'll just ask this. What do you think of the concept of a concept series based on Matthew 28:19 on drawing portraits, representation of people from different cultures in representing that Bible verse? I have been working on this series and sharing it on Instagram, and I want to use it as a way to witness. Okay, what do you think?
Awesome. Yeah. So that Bible verse, going to make disciples of all nations, I think that is amazing. I think that's the kind of, we were talking about earlier, having a series that you'd maybe work on. I think that's a really good thing. Where I said about developing your style, developing your skills when you're starting out, setting yourself a project like that is a really great way to build those skills. So I think that like I said, you know, some parts of the Bible aren't as representative because they mostly take place in one part of the world, but that's the type of verse where it really does speak to our whole world, and it's a great way of drawing people from all different cultures. And I think sharing that on Instagram, sharing it regularly so people kind of expect that it's going to be coming is a really great job. So I think that is a great way to witness. I think maybe the next thing to think about is you're creating this content, you're going to be illustrating these things. How do you get the witnessing side into it a bit more? Maybe what captions do you use, or is there somewhere you can maybe have a page on a website or a blog where you explain what the project is about, and you can have a link that sends them to there from just seeing the images. So I guess it's, yeah, how do you take that to the next step?
So I'd like to ask you a question as an illustrator, a designer, photographer. There's you and there are many others in church. What can we pray specifically for people like you? So what should our prayers be for you, people like you in that ministry?
Yeah, thanks. Wow, really cool question. I think one thing for me is always I always, you know, pray this for myself. I love that people pray this for me, is to remember the reason behind what we're doing. You know, I think for me, one danger, whatever type of work it is, if you are using your abilities or your interests for spreading the gospel, for doing the work of God, the only danger is sometimes when we get so busy doing the work that we neglect our relationship with God. And I think that is something that is super important, I think, to always remember the why of what you're doing. And I think not only just not to overwork and always to come back to time spent with God, but also, as I said, like examining those different influences is really important. But I think it also, when you remember why you're doing it, you're really careful about what influences you really take in and think, okay, well, I like this visual style, but I don't know if that's the right route to go down because, you know, it doesn't really communicate the message of the gospel that well. It looks good, but maybe it doesn't communicate it well. So I think, yeah, those prayers, I think, for any creative people to always kind of remember the why behind what they do. And, you know, as much as all the advice I give about knowing how much to charge and working professionally and stuff, there will be times where you almost do more work than you're being paid for, or you are working for free sometimes. I wouldn't say to anyone, never work for free. I think don't always work for free is good advice, but sometimes there'll be a project you're so passionate about and, you know, the ends of it, that you'll be like, you know what, I would just give my time to this because it's so important. But I think, yeah, if you know the why behind why you're doing it, then your work will grow, you know, because you're serving something higher than just your own profit.
Okay, so you want us to pray for you guys to remember the why, well, not even remember, but know the why, stay connected to God as the source of your talent giver, the giver of gifts, the giver of talents. Remain focused and be careful of your outside influences.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, we will keep that in prayer then. Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I've learned a few things. If you've seen my head down, it's because I've been writing loads of notes. You said that we can contact you if we needed any other advice or to follow your projects that you're doing. Yes.
Yeah.
Is there
yeah,
how can we contact you?
No worries. So the best way probably going to be through email, which is just info@ashleybloom.net, and my website is ashleybloom.net, so you can find things in there. And I guess the one that I post on fairly regularly is Instagram, which is Ashley Bloom Images.
Okay.
And I think that's the same for Facebook. And also, yeah, another little plug, at David's Mighty Men 2020, if you want to join the actual study this coming Sabbath evening.
Okay, at 8 o'clock you said, or was it 7?
It's 7 o'clock, yeah,
7.
every Saturday at 7 o'clock for the next 7 weeks.
Excellent. We look forward to that.
So,
if you're wondering what to do on your Saturday nights,
Yeah, no better place. But thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you guys for joining the discussion and the questions. It's been a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. It really has for us too. Okay, so let's pray to close. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that you've given us. Thank you for the gifts and for the talents and for the dedication that you've placed upon Ashley's heart to spread the gospel in such a creative way and to a professional standard as well. Thank you for allowing him to be an inspiration to many, not just inside the church, but to those outside as well. Please continue to bless him with a passion to spread your word, give him fresh inspiration, help him to remember the why, which is what he's asked, help him to stay connected to you so that he has a why, and that why is because of you, because you've given him a mission. Lord, help him to remain focused, and we just thank you for his availability tonight to be able to speak to us and further inspire us. Be with all of those who are watching this evening and who will watch at later dates. I pray that they too will be inspired to be the best creatives that they can be, Lord, and just use their talents for you to bring people closer to you. So thank you for the time that you've allowed us to share together, and help us to keep spreading the gospel in creative ways. In your name, amen.